Okay, welcome to everybody. So that's the first keynote speech of the inaugural conference of the Julis-Rabinowitz Center, and welcome to all of you. And I have the task to introduce Paul Krugman. That's actually not an easy task because everybody knows him, and if you check his blog, you can even read what he ate for breakfast. So I thought I will tell you when I saw Paul the first time in my life. I was an undergraduate student. I went to the AEA meetings in order to see all these famous economists. And then he gave a talk on geography, and suddenly the mic didn't work. So he was knocking on the mic and it didn't work. And he made the announcement, somebody smarter than him should come to fix it. And this was not so smart because nobody dared to come. Luckily, somebody actually from the back could fix it without coming in front of to the podium. So you will expect a lot, and I think you will also see a lot. I think you see more than just blaming the Greece for having not so good politicians or blaming the Germans for being very efficient or frugal. So let's applause and wait for Paul's insights.
Wow. Thanks for coming, and let's celebrate the opening of the new center and the good topic for an opening set of meetings, because boy, as you all know, it's a pretty terrible world out there. It's been inconceivable. I think if you had said in 2006 that we would be where we are now, very few people would have believed you. Even those of us who were reasonably pessimistic, who were worried about the housing bubble, and even Eurosceptics who had some doubts about the wisdom of the single currency, nobody predicted that it would be as difficult as it is right now. And it's a broad crisis. It's a North Atlantic crisis, I like to say. There's more or less equivalent shocks on both sides, and in many ways similar shocks on both sides of the Atlantic, with a lot of equivalencies. It's actually almost eerie if you look at everything except the scenery. Ireland and Nevada are almost twins. They look exactly the same by the numbers. Not if you look out your window, but otherwise they look almost exactly the same. But at this point, it's really clear that Europe is the more difficult crisis. The United States, we don't know whether we're on the mend. There are some hints that we are, but the U.S. doesn't seem to have an ongoing process of unraveling. We may be slowly healing, but Europe is a very, very severe problem, and it's one that is heartbreaking, if you like, both in human terms and intellectually, because I think one of the things that one really that I couldn't have anticipated, or certainly didn't anticipate, was just how wrong-headed the discussion of policy would be in this crisis, and the sheer doggedness with which people cling to views of what the problem is that are manifestly not true. And that's true on both sides of the Atlantic again, but it's maybe most striking in the European case, which makes things that's layered on top of an inherently very difficult situation. It turns out, as I hope I'll explain a little bit, that the euro, the single currency, which was created without many of the preconditions to make a single currency workable, has turned into a trap that even with the best of will and even with clarity of thought would be difficult to escape. But of course, the best of will and clarity of thought hasn't been particularly available either. So it's a very difficult situation. So when I was asked to do this talk, the title I came up with reflected something that I didn't think was being sufficiently appreciated. And it originally came out of some of you may know that the economic historians have been the best and have been the people coming off best in these terrible few years, because they're the ones who look at at the past, and it turns out that there are repetitive patterns, and the comparisons have been really useful and I think have been your best guide to what will happen next. And so Barry Eichengreen and Kevin O'Rourke did a very, very, very widely read paper in the heat of the crisis, where they pointed out that the first year of this crisis was actually more or less as bad as the first year of the Great Depression, which came as a shock to people here because we think of it from an American perspective, where we had a very, very bad Great Depression. And it wasn't nearly as bad this time around, but other parts of the world didn't suffer as badly in the Great Depression, but this time we're fully sharing in the burden, and that included Europe. Update that to right now, and clearly the United States has done a lot. It's not good by any means, but it's no Great Depression. Europe, on the other hand, has done worse in a number of dimensions than the US, and is not that far from replicating the troubles it had in the 1930s. It's not quite as bad, but it's pretty bad. And on top of that, the theme that I've already kind of introduced is replicating many of the mistakes of the 1930s. It's quite extraordinary how little we seem to have learned over these past 80 years. So just a little bit on the reality. So we don't have particularly good national accounts data, though we have some guesstimates. We do have industrial production data. And so I've taken the League of Nations data, that's the blue line, for Europe, and I've taken the Eurostat data on industrial production. And okay, we're not as far down, never got as far down as in 1933 last time around, but not as much better as you might think, and of course with Europe stuttering now, the differences are not so large. The U.S. would be a more dramatic decline in the Great Depression, but this time around in Europe is I say, it's not that far short of being a hit to production that is comparable to that of the Great Depression. Varies across countries. Germany had a very terrible 1930s and has not, of course, had that this time. The UK had a relatively good 1930s and is actually, the UK is clearly doing worse in output than it did in the corresponding period of the Great Depression. GDP numbers. So this is just, I know that's presumably, nice big screen, so it's not as unreadable as I would have expected. These are, for those of you who are into these things, these are the Madison numbers on GDP, which are intelligent guesses, but of course they didn't actually maintain national accounts then, so it's not to be taken too seriously. And again, Eurostat, and I put them on the same scale so that you get some sense. And we are having a significant number of Great Depression level slumps in Europe. Not everybody, obviously not Germany. France is not having a Great Depression. The UK, for all of its problems, is not having a Great Depression. But Spain, hard to read some of my own writing, but Ireland is a full Great Depression level slump. Greece, Latvia. And unemployment rates, again, problems of comparability, but with now 24% unemployment in Spain and 50.5% among 25 and under. That's not a recession. That's not a somewhat difficult time. That's actual full-out economic catastrophe. So how, this wasn't supposed to happen in the modern world, right? Because this is not, we knew that stagflation was a problem. We knew that if you were faced with major supply shocks, that there aren't any very good policy options. But this is pretty clearly, it's a demand shock. Whoops, sorry. It's not really this is the kind of thing that was supposed to be manageable. We're supposed to know how to use fiscal and monetary policy to ensure that severe slumps don't happen. But that has turned out not to be true. Not true even here, but very definitely not true in Europe. Worse than that, if you actually look at the policies that have been followed in much of Europe, they are not so different from the policies that were followed in the 1930s. If you like, the single currency has come to play much the role that the gold standard did in the 1930s, where the defense of that standard has essentially blockaded any of the use of the normal tools of macroeconomic policy, where concerns about deficits in a world where countries are trying to defend their parity have led to fiscal policy reinforcing rather than fighting the slump. Sometimes you read the headlines and you say, wait, what year is this? Why does it sound so much like 1932, given all that we're supposed to have learned in the time that's passed? What I just said, the question, if I sound like I've spent the last 2 nights sleeping on airplanes, that's because I did. So if occasionally I may stumble over words. I haven't said a word yet about the narrative that has dominated a lot of discussion in Europe. And I think maybe that's the entry point I should be choosing. So if you read a characteristic discussion at the European Commission, or if you read, I have to say, very many newspaper reports, you will get a story which says, well, this is a story about countries that live beyond their means. And particularly it's a story about governments that live beyond their means. And so you'll see again and again the story that it's about fiscal profligacy, and the crisis we have now is the result of irresponsible fiscal policies in the past. This is often stated not as a hypothesis even, but simply as a fact. So just a couple of days ago, I read a newspaper report in a prestigious newspaper, which happens to also employ me, that said that failure to keep careful tabs on fiscal policy is what led to the crisis in Europe, which is a fairly bizarre statement. It's arguably a story about Greece, although even Greece, I think, is more complicated. But the Hellenization of our discourse, the way that we've made everything be a Greek story, has been a tremendously misleading part of the way we've dealt with this crisis. The quintessential Euro crisis country, and now, in fact, the epicenter of the crisis, as it really should have been all along, is Spain. And the story about Spain is definitely not fiscal profligacy. So on the eve of the crisis, Spain had a budget surplus, larger than Germany's budget surplus. It had a level of public debt as a share of GDP that was about half of Germany's. To all appearances, Spain was actually a paragon of fiscal responsibility, and was viewed as such at the time. If you go back and look, Martin Wolf has gone through some of this. The IMF believed that Spain had a structural budget surplus. It did not believe that that this was artificial. Spanish bank regulation was widely praised. Actually, at this point, still, I have my checking account at Sovereign, and if you call up the telephone banking, it still boasts part of Santander, one of the world's strongest banks. So they're saying, trust us, we're not American, we're actually Spanish. But the general picture was one where it was widely regarded as a solid economy. Not everyone saw that. Not everyone agreed. And I actually mean to check this out. In, I think, 2006, there was a conference in Barcelona where an economist by the name of Olivier Blanchard tried to tell the Spaniards that he was very concerned about their large current account deficits and their housing boom, and he didn't think it was a solid situation. But he was dismissed. What did he know? No idea. So it turns out that no one really saw it. Okay, so it wasn't actually Spain certainly was not a story of fiscal profligacy. The rest, okay, Ireland looks like Spain in this respect. Italy is complicated. Italy has actually ran relatively small deficits in recent years, but it has a large overhang of debt from past irresponsibility. And Portugal is Spain with a slight Greek accent, I guess, if you wanted to look at the numbers. It's, but Spain is the epicenter, and it's not that story at all. So what actually did happen? Look across the board, you see that, so now I'm just looking at the average deficits, budget deficits over the period from 1999 to 2007. I start with 99 for a reason, because that's the creation of the euro, and 2007, of course, is the last pre-crisis year. Red are countries that are generally seen as being in crisis now. As you see, Spain, slight surpluses. Italy deficits, but not huge. Greece is very way out there, but you would not have looking, even in retrospect, the budget deficits don't predict the crisis. What does predict it pretty well is balance of payments. Very large current account deficits in some European countries. Estonia is not part of our usual group, but has in fact had a very severe slump without ever having had really a fiscal issue. I have no idea what's going on in the Slovak Republic, but whatever. But otherwise, it picks out your crisis countries pretty well, and that's clear. So I think actually many people are now coming to the understanding that this is ultimately a balance of payments related story. But how can that be? It was supposed to be the case that you weren't going to have balance of payments problems, right? Because you had a single currency. Payments in what? It's all euros. We weren't supposed to be at all at risk. But in retrospect, it's horribly clear. If I can say, the one thing about this crisis in Europe is it's the combination of horrifying human and political implications, as well as economic, and gratifying clarity in terms of the story. It's one of the clearer stories out there that in terms of what went wrong. There we go. So I found out that there's no safe acronym for Greece, Ireland, Portugal, Spain, and Italy. I put this one because everyone likes the pigs, and I thought, well, I'd be nicer. And then I got accused of being a racist for using this one. I don't quite understand. So these are current account imbalances as a share of the euro area's GDP. And so I say Hans Werner Zinn's here. Germany in the late 90s was actually a rather troubled, depressed economy. But the creation of the euro solved that problem while creating a much bigger one down the road. Basically, markets, investors came to believe that if you were a Eurozone country, you were safe. No problem with your bonds. What could go wrong? And so what had in the past been large differentials in interest rates between Greece and even Spain and Germany on the other side collapsed. There were occasionally actually Irish 10-year bond rates were slightly below German, but in any case, essentially no difference, essentially a convergence, which meant a sharp fall in interest rates in Southern Europe, which unleashed large capital inflows, large housing bubbles, and very large flows of money from north to south. Felt good as long as it lasted. They were rapid economic growth in the countries that were receiving large capital inflows. Felt helpful for for Germany as well, because it was on the other side, and its relatively weak domestic demand was more than made up for by a surge in intra-European exports. And then, well, the side consequence of all this was that you had relatively full employment economies. Always some problems about measurement. So Spain had 8% unemployment, but it felt like full employment, and presumably was in any real sense, which led to higher rates of inflation in the Southern European zone. And use different measures, and people can fight about the various measures. But a cumulative process. Now, the Eurozone as a whole, of course, is in between. The Eurozone average, which actually turns out to almost exactly be France, is somewhere in between. So the apparent overvaluation of the gypsy economies doesn't look as bad if you compare it with the Eurozone or compare it with France, but clearly a massive divergence. And I wouldn't stress, there's a kind of industry of trying to get different measures and what is the exact right measure of overvaluation. I don't think you want to get too far into that. I think you want to assess it on a PPE basis, which is proof of the pudding is in the eating. That the reality clearly is that Southern Europe got priced out, that they got to a situation where their manufacturing was uncompetitive because, hey, money was pouring in to support construction booms, consumer spending booms, and okay, all good. Now, if we had balance of payments data within the United States, you would probably have seen something not too different. You probably would have seen that I gather that some people now like to call it the sand states. It's basically Florida, California, Nevada, Arizona, would have been receiving large capital inflows from the Midwest. And there would have been, there was somewhat faster inflation in those regions. There was, in a way, it was probably true that Florida got somewhat overvalued over the same period. But I think not, a couple of things going on there. One, it wasn't quite as extreme, because you had a general complacency, a general runaway neglect of risks. This is the best economics title of certainly of the decade and maybe of the generation is Ken Rogoff and Carmen Reinhardt's book, This Time is Different. Because the point is it never is, but people always think it is, and so the neglect of past risks of leverage was widespread across the advanced world. But in Europe, you had the additional false security that came from the single currency. And then the music stopped. What happens at that point? I'm sorry, I meant to say one other thing about the US versus Europe. To some extent, although it's proving, I've been trying to put this together numerically, but it's a little elusive, but mobility of labor must have, at least to some extent, helped cushion it here, that you had the booming regions and people moved there. And that will get me in a moment to some underlying analytic issues that I think we've learned a lot about. Okay, the end came. The bubbles burst. The capital flows, at least the private capital flows, dried up, and suddenly you have a crisis within the euro area. What do we? What's supposed to happen at this point? Well, if this were, the problem is not simply that Southern Europe was overspending, because although it was, though at least initially not the public sector, the private sector was spending beyond its means, as it turned out. That wasn't obvious in 2006, but it was obvious by 2010 that had happened. But in pulling back, the problem is that it's a collapse of these foreign capital financed spending that has been sustaining the economy. But there's no simple mechanism by which something can take its place. What you really need, this is all very basic, standard, old-fashioned international macro, you need some expenditure switching to compensate for the expenditure reduction. You need, Spain needs to export more manufactured goods to make up for the large decline in construction employment. But that's what's going to make that happen. What's the incentive? What's going to change the incentives and make Spain an attractive place to move a lot of manufacturing? Well, it has to be a fall in relative costs, relative prices, which, if Spain still had its own currency, would be most easily accomplished by simply devaluing. But it didn't have its own currency. And you're left with the necessity of trying to make that adjustment in some other way, which is basically, it has to have not an adjustment, a one-time adjustment through a currency change, but an ongoing adjustment by actually either cutting or at least having wages fail to rise as rapidly as in the surplus countries. So Europe was left with the necessity, if it's going to make this thing work, of having a process of internal devaluation. It's one of those horrible jargon phrases that I think confuses people, but the notion was that you'd have internal devaluation. And that's still the hope. If this is going to work at all, if the Eurozone is going to survive, it's going to have to involve a large fall in the relative cost of labor in the peripheral countries to bring them back to something like where they were before this great inflow of capital took place. I guess there was a view that if only you had sufficient flexibility in labor markets, that could be done, that we could make that happen. We've learned two things that one should have suspected before, but are now really confirmed. One of them is that nobody has that much flexibility. I thought we knew that, but apparently that wasn't widely accepted until the crisis hit. And some people are still not accepting it. But the reality is that even countries that have what are widely praised as being highly flexible labor markets do not easily cut wages. Just doesn't happen. Nobody does that. You can, if you look at some of the stories you'll hear, there will be people telling you, well, pointing to big wage cuts here and there, Latvia, whatever. Almost always those turn out to be big cuts in the wages of public sector employees. Private sector wages creep down slowly, even in the face of very high unemployment. Ireland. Ireland, not that long ago, Ireland was a paragon not just of fiscal responsibility, but of flexibility. People talked about how wonderful it was. George Osborne called it a shining example of the extent of the possible in long-term policy making, and it was supposed to be really adjust. And in the face of 14% unemployment, Ireland had several years of 14% unemployment. Ireland has managed to get its wages down by a few percent. Very, very, very slow process. Grinding wage deflation is all that you get, even in the most flexible economies. And by the way, this was true. The United States. We've had a lot of long ago, back when we were discussing whether the proposed single European currency was a good idea. Olivier Blanchard and Larry Katz looked at regional adjustment in the United States and found out that wage flexibility was a very small part of that. That it was actually mostly people moving. So it turns out that Europe doesn't have a good adjustment mechanism when stuff goes wrong. Diversion into the question of when does it actually make sense to have a single currency? So it turns out that I guess not in the international macro area, but not so much, I don't know how widely it's known. We do have a theory, it's kind of a loose jointed theory, we do have a theory of optimum currency areas, which is more like a checklist of things to look for, that under which your currency might make sense. And there are two I'd say two principal strands, Mundell and Kennan. So Robert Mundell and our own Peter Kennan. The Mundell argument was that that you really shouldn't have a single currency unless you have high mobility of labor. So that if you have asymmetric shocks, if for whatever reason you have a boom in one place and a slump in another, if workers move freely from the place that's slumping to the place that's booming, then it's going to be relatively easy to make the currency work. And if not, not. So you should be looking for that high mobility of labor. The Kennan argument was that you really need fiscal integration, that you need a situation in which there's some automatic transfers from the booming to the slumping parts of your currency area. Both of these clearly have some truth to them. And both of them, by the way, suggested 20 years ago that maybe this wasn't such a good idea. Because you looked at Europe, I mean, no one can quantify all of this stuff, but you could certainly look at the Europe-US comparison, and it was obvious right away that labor mobility was not comparable to the United States and was not likely to become so in the foreseeable future. Cultural differences, language barriers, it was just obvious. And what was striking actually was that even within European countries, labor mobility tends to be quite low. Geographic mobility of labor tends to be quite low. I always thought an interesting role model for the future euro was actually the nation of Switzerland, where it turns out that there's virtually no labor mobility between Francophone and German-speaking Switzerland. And so how could you expect there to be high labor mobility within the European Union? But then also fiscal integration. I said that Ireland and Nevada they are actually quite similar in terms of the size of the housing bubble, the unemployment rate once the bubble burst, quite close parallel. They have roughly similar populations. Again, one of them actually has water and the other doesn't, but aside from that, it's but while times are miserable in Nevada, it's not a crisis on the same scale, and the reason is health care for the retirees is paid for from Washington. Retirement for the retirees is paid for from Washington, and a substantial part of the bank losses, or a substantial part of the losses on mortgage lending is falling on Fannie and Freddie. So there is an effect. Without any policy decision, Nevada is receiving a level of transfers from less hard-hit parts of the United States on a scale that none of the European peripheral countries could dream of receiving. It basically helps to have a nation with a fair bit of fiscal federalism. We don't have enough to have avoided significant austerity cutbacks at the state and local level, but nothing like the European situation. At least as I read it, the way that it's actually played out, it is basically that Kennan has trumped Mundell, that the Princeton version has sort of beaten the Canadian version, not that the labor mobility isn't an issue, but that the clear and present source of extreme stress has been the lack of fiscal integration, and that has made it extremely difficult for Europe to deal with this shock. Also, by the way, when we had the discussions, there was a lot of good economics done in the early 90s over the discussion of possible monetary union. The problem was most of the good economics led you to be highly skeptical about whether it was a good idea, and that was all ignored. So I was told that this is hearsay. I was told by people who worked on the report "One Market, One Money" that the European Commission prepared in 1990 that they were initially asked to prepare a report on the costs and benefits of a single currency. And after some draft pieces of chapters were prepared, they were told to prepare a report on the benefits of a single currency. And I sort of understand why. The appeal, the romance of the single currency, the idea that this was a step towards a true political union for Europe was very strong. People did not want to hear about it. And there was a widespread, there were many assertions to the effect that because we would have sound policies, there would not, in fact, be large asymmetric shocks. That turns out, of course, not to be true. And in fact, we faced the mother of all asymmetric shocks, something that was larger than even the pessimists imagined could happen. Because of the collapse of capital flows to Southern Europe, you had both severe recessions and fiscal crises. The fiscal crisis is, for the most part, a consequence, not a cause, of the underlying problems. But that doesn't mean it isn't real. And there was, the revenue collapsed. Countries that had been relatively sound began to move into large deficit. And also, investors looked at the prospects and lost faith in eventual repayment. To a large extent, the loss of private capital flows has been made up with official flows through both through explicit programs from the Troika and through ECB financing. The condition for all of that has been austerity. And so, as I said, it's been extremely frustrating. The discussion of the crisis and its origins has latched onto the notion that fiscal irresponsibility caused it, despite overwhelming. It's, all you need to do is just look at those Spanish numbers, and it's just not true. But maybe the history is expansionary. That you would cut spending, that would improve confidence, and that would outweigh any direct drag on the economies affected. This was based on some extremely questionable, not questionable because it was deliberately misleading, but very, very questionable on close inspection interpretations of historical episodes. Basically, all of the alleged cases of expansionary austerity in the past melted away when you looked at them hard. They all either they weren't really expansionary, or they involved something that wasn't on the table in Europe, like a devaluation, or a sharp cut in long-term interest rates, which were just not going to be possible. Well, now the results are in. This is not a perfect, I should say, evidence on fiscal policy. For the most part, right, so we have econometrics, which I think one of the things I've learned in my career is that in the end, sophisticated econometrics never convinces anyone of anything. That the only things that actually possibly move opinion are very clear-cut natural experiments, where you get something that's really dramatic that happens, and then people can look at the results. And then, so most of what we used to know about fiscal policy came actually from wars and their aftermath, because that's the only time you got really big changes in government spending. But now, in addition to wars as a natural experiment, we also have pestilence. Well, not really, but we have is dramatic cuts. No, we don't have stimulus, but we have dramatic cuts forced as part of austerity programs. This is from fourth quarter 2007 to fourth quarter 2011. And it's the horizontal axis is the change in real government purchases as a share of start date GDP. And the vertical axis is the actual change in real GDP. Now, it's not a clean experiment because, for two reasons. One is that there have been changes in taxes and transfers as well. And I can't capture those in this picture. The other is there may be some reverse correlation, reverse causation, that countries in trouble may be forced into austerity. But still, if you had believed the doctrines of austerity as they were being preached, let's say in ECB reports in May or June of 2010, and you would not have expected to see this picture. What you see instead is extreme contraction as a result of fiscal austerity. It says something about the state of the debate within Europe that Latvia is held up as a role model, right? Hey, look at that. They did great stuff with that 17% decline in real GDP. Well, they have managed to restore access to markets, financial markets, largely because they didn't have very much debt to begin with, hardly any. Boy, I guess a few more success stories like that, and you'll be back to the Middle Ages. Okay. Now what? The question and let me say, something I think other people probably encounter. You try to talk about the difficulties of Europe, and you get accused of being anti-European, which is not at all where I come from. This is right. Europe is a noble experiment. It's something that we really, really want to succeed. If you care about, because it stands for a lot more than just, more efficient economic organization. It's about peace and democracy, and the whole European project is something that you very much want to succeed. And but now it's in dire trouble. On the current course, it's not going to. The current course basically heads for catastrophe. Because what's being asked of the countries in trouble is not possible. They're being asked to restore competitiveness through grinding wage deflation, which means years of high unemployment. The deflation means that the debt burden, which in the case of Spain is the public debt burden is significant, but the private debt burden is even bigger, is actually going to grow. So you're condemning them to debt deflation. And you just think about that. You're thinking about 24% unemployment, 50% youth unemployment, year after year. That is not going to happen, and shouldn't happen. That's an impossible situation. Can the euro break up? There was an interesting discussion. I was persuaded initially by Barry Eichengreen that it could not. If you asked me 3 years ago, I thought it could not, because the argument was any government that so much as breathed a hint that it might think of leaving the euro would unleash an enormous run on its banks, precipitate a massive banking crisis. And so there was, in effect, a poison pill that kept you from leaving. Turns out that I think the right way to think about this is to think about Argentina. The Argentine convertibility law, which fixed 1 peso, $1 between 1991 and 2001, and more or less said that they couldn't print pesos, that they could only issue pesos in return for foreign exchange that was brought in. A currency board system was supposed to be unbreakable, irreversible, for the same reason, that any hint of a change would precipitate a banking crisis. What actually happened was they had the banking crisis anyway. For a banking crisis first, and after the banks were closed, with only a trickle of fund withdrawals allowed, that's when they threw in the towel and abandoned the peg. Now, it's even harder for a European country, but not, in the end, logistically impossible. Just something they really don't want to do. But you can see the story quite easily. It's there is in effect a run on the Greek banks already, but it's a slow motion run, and loans from the ECB are preventing collapse. But either it accelerates, or the ECB has had enough, or whatever, and we're in that kind of situation. And the currency gets overstamped with stamps that say this is not a euro, this is a new drachma, and it can happen. And if it happens, I would say that it's more likely than not for Greece. You just look at even if you believe the projections in the latest Troika agreement with Greece, they look impossible, and you shouldn't believe them either. So, and then does that lead to domino effects? If one country leaves, what happens next? It's alarmingly easy to see how the whole thing breaks up. So how do you make it survive? Because even if it was a mistake, you would really like to avoid stepping back here. Partly because a breakup of the euro would be extremely disruptive. in the end, you'd get past that, but you know, in the long run, you could make Europe work again with separate currencies, but in the long run, we're all dead and all that. The transition costs could be very severe, but also the political defeat would be enormous. To have Europe's greatest project on the road to a unified Europe turn into a debacle is not really what you want to see. So what would it take to make it work? I'd say that really the main thing that you need is, because it's so difficult to cut wages, you need a situation in which wage cuts either aren't needed or need be much smaller, which comes down to saying if we expected 3 or 4% inflation for the euro area over the next 5 years, if we expected 4% inflation, this would look vastly easier. The adjustment problem for Spain would be significantly smaller. The debt burdens would look significantly less crushing. So if you went and had the case for a higher inflation target is actually reasonably strong even for the United States. And the case in general that inflation, a little bit of inflation is good on both the demand and the supply side is reasonably strong, because that wage rigidity is a feature here as well. You can actually see there's been a spike in the number of workers getting precisely 0 wage increases in the United States, which is an indication that wage rigidity is really binding now. But Europe has those problems on a much greater scale. In a way, you can say that lacking the other preconditions, lacking the high labor mobility and above all the fiscal integration, Europe really needs a higher inflation rate to make it work. Well, we know what the reaction will be from the European core, and it's a wildly, almost unmentionable policy. And there is this collision in Europe now between the irresistible force and the immovable object. The thing as set up cannot work, but the solutions seem to be impossible. And now maybe there's a way to make that happen, to get past all of that. I have to say that that Mario Draghi has turned out to be a cleverer person, a more subtle and better leader than at first we thought. There was an acute financial crisis in Europe in late fall last year that threatened to just blow the whole thing apart in a matter of weeks. And it was clear that what was really needed was for the ECB to step in and buy the bonds of the crisis countries, and which was a wildly unpopular notion. And so Draghi said, no, we will never under any circumstances do that. We will, however, lend unlimited amounts to banks and accepting sovereign debt as security, as collateral. So, clever fellow. But it takes something more than that, and something much more obvious and more sustained to make this thing work. I don't know what happens. It's a very difficult outlook. So it's funny. I think Martin Wolf and I are batting forth in the op-ed pages on these issues. And Martin, maybe he wasn't feeling well, because he actually had a relatively optimistic column a couple of days ago. That's about as rare for him as it is for me, in which he basically said he offered no evidence that anyone's prepared to do the right thing, but just said that in the end, European elites will not allow this project to fail. I hope he's right, but wow. And who would have imagined that we could screw up this badly? Questions, I think. Yeah, I'm going to handle it. Small room, friendly crowd. Yeah. Actually, I think since they're taping this, actually people should probably head for these mics that are in the middle. So if you have a question, you might want to ask. Right? Am I right about that? Yeah. Sorry, I'm just thinking. We didn't think this is casual. Yeah. So yeah, go ahead.
Hi, thank you very much for taking time to come here. You've done a lot of traveling in the past few days.
But the trip here was taking the elevator down from the 4th floor, so that wasn't so bad.
But at the end of your talk, you touched upon an item of interest with the ECB's long-term refinancing operations. Yeah. And I would just be interested to hear, though you don't know what will happen, your predictions. People are expecting maybe a crunch in 3 years when they come due, increased inflation, and just be interested to hear your opinion on that subject.
Well, if Europe has actually gotten to a strategy that makes this feasible, there won't be a crunch in 3 years because everyone will have started to believe that European sovereigns will be able to pay their debts, not Greece, but the rest. And the inflation, first of all, some inflation would be a good thing. Well, it would really be helpful. But this is something that's both sides of the Atlantic. People talk about the Fed also as if the central bank cannot somehow that those balance sheets will turn into explosive inflationary pressures once the economy recovers. I don't see any reason on either side to believe that that's true. It's quite easy for central banks to tighten. They can, even if they can't necessarily divest themselves of all those assets in a short period of time, there are lots of other things they can do. They can raise policy rates. They can, on this side of the Atlantic, you can raise the interest rate on reserves. So I don't see any risk there. I mean, there is an issue that the ECB may take a paper loss on some of what it's doing, which ought not to matter at all. But again, this problem of a currency without a country arises. The Fed is clearly, we know who the Fed turns to if it has a loss on its balance sheet, which it just goes down the road to the Treasury. Exactly who takes responsibility for keeping the ECB solvent is not entirely clear. But no, I mean, I think that actually this has been characteristic of everything in this crisis. We spend a lot of time worrying about hypothetical risks that are not actually happening, and remarkably little time worrying about the actual ongoing disaster that we're actually experiencing. You know, the notion that we might have to worry 3 years from now about possible inflationary impacts of the ECB's expanded balance sheet, which I don't think is even going to happen. But even if you did, boy, if this is, I think what you really should be worried about is the euro as a project going to survive those 3 years?
Thank you.
I've heard a lot of people present on the difficulty of solving the Eurozone crisis and not clear what the solution is or whether or not there's enough consensus to be able to craft and get behind a solution. So let's take it a different way. Let's assume it blows up in some respect. As Greece leaves or the euro breaks apart. So my question is this: how consequential to the real economy and standards of living and social contract to Europe would such an event be? And how consequential would it be to the United States and the rest of the world's economies?
Okay. Yeah. So, start from the way things would look after the dust settles. Would the European economy suffer a crippling blow if it reverted to a set of independent currencies? And the answer pretty clearly is not. I mean, it had a set of independent currencies not that long ago. There were some transactions costs involved in that, some uncertainties created by that, but the notion that it was unworkable, it requires that you forget things that are still quite fresh in living memory. Or for that matter, if you want to ask, how can you have a tightly integrated continental economy with fluctuating exchange rates in the middle of it? There's this country up there called Canada, and it doesn't seem to me to be in a state of dire disarray. And Canada is very much the illustration that you can have. You know, Canada is smaller in population than the European Big Four. And if you look at the geography of Canada, it's basically closer to the United States than it is to itself. And so and yet it manages to function with an independent currency. So you can do that. Now, the transition is a mess because you have now a web of debts, and there'd be a legal morass. There is no provision for what those debts become. And they're not just public debts, they're private debts. And who knows how you resolve all of that. So the transition could be very difficult. Argentine situation, there was about a year and a half, only about a year and a half of severe economic disruption, and then a recovery. But there are, and so that I think is a reason to think that belief that it's a really, really prolonged process of disruption is probably wrong. But there are some ways in which Argentina, things would be different. And particularly when we think about Greece, we think a Greek exit from the euro and the replacement of the euro with the new drachma, which then devalues drastically, is supposed to produce an export boom. But what is Greece going to export? Well, largely, a lot of it's going to be tourism. And the chaotic aftermath of the breakup of a currency union is probably not an ideal environment for tourists. Not impossible, right? You can insulate, right? But you've got to think of, you're going to have a lot of package tours of Germans and Brits heading for Greek islands and being reassured that they will come nowhere near the stuff that's actually going on in Athens, and it's going to be a little difficult. So it's going to be ugly. But I mean, if we can we could find ourselves 7 years down the road with a perfectly reasonably functioning European economy, but with the biggest project, the biggest piece of the European project, the most adventurous thing, having failed utterly. And that's really bad for a wide range of things. I mean, there is a political component. The failure will hurt very badly, and that will resonate down the decades.
When you say the failure will hurt, from a political standpoint, are you referring to things like what Helmut Kohl said, that if the euro fails, we go back to war? I mean, what are you referring to?
You want to avoid Godwin's law violations here. People do internet know that, right? The original Godwin's law was that any sufficiently long discussion thread ends up with people referring to Hitler, and so. So you don't. It's hard to. But look, the economic distress, and look, the euro was supposed to serve as a unifying, and instead it's produced a situation where there's intense hostility from both sides, right? With Germany considering the Southern Europeans irresponsible spendthrifts, and the Southern Europeans considering the Germans brutal taskmasters, and some truth in both views. And so this is not good. And you can see, look, our colleague Kim Shepley has been doing remarkable work on events in Hungary, which has got some scary political developments going on. And clearly, although Hungary's not on the euro, it's the Hungarian economic crisis, which is related to all of this, is an important factor in all of that. So, yeah, I mean, you don't want to get too melodramatic, but a lot of the peace and democracy that was the whole point will be at least lose some of its force. It can degrade the whole situation.
Okay, Professor Krugman, my question has to do with the election, or what it looks like the probable election of Monsieur François Hollande as the next chief executive of France. Is that, would you be willing to venture some comments if he were confirmed as the new president of France a little over 2 weeks from now?
Yeah.
Whether the impact, both in terms of the kind of thinking that goes on in Europe, as well as the actual policies that may be implemented.
Okay, I know nothing about Hollande, so I have nothing. I guess I'm probably fantasizing, but I'd like to hope that it will actually that an Hollande election will spur some flexibility. I mean, right now, the way European leaders have responded to the crisis is just by doubling down. At each stage, doubling down on the same policies that failed. Every 6 months, they double down on the same policies that failed in the previous 6 months. So every time you see that austerity is leading to a deepening slump, the answer is more austerity. And which isn't to say that the alternatives are easy, but at some point you have to say, wait, this is not a workable strategy. And if we no longer have a completely reliable Franco-German alliance to impose these policies, then maybe you get a chance to rethink the position. So that's a pretty weak, right? That's saying, we might hope that he's elected because we don't know what he will do, and something different might be better than what's happening now. That's a hell of a way to say to call for a politician to take leadership. But there is a little bit. That's a yes minister. We must do something. This is something. Therefore, we must do it. There's a little bit of that. But anyway, but that's that. But I'm certainly not. The fact that if Sarkozy is booted, that it would be taken as a blow to the current European economic strategy. That's a good thing because the current strategy is not working.
Hi. I wanted to ask you a question about, to use your phrase, hypothetical risks that don't happen. So Jürgen Stark said that if Greece defaulted, it would be a Lehman-like disaster. And then
sorry, what like?
Sorry?
What? What? I didn't catch the adjective.
Lehman-like disaster.
Oh, yeah.
And then they did default to a certain extent, and it wasn't that big a deal. So I was wondering whether Italy, which has 120% debt to GDP ratio and growth exceeding only Haiti and Zimbabwe over the last 3 decades, should default. Your thoughts on that?
I don't think. I mean, actually, Italy is a closer. One of the arguments has been that default starts to look attractive if you actually have a primary surplus, so that you're actually you're borrowing only to pay interest on the debt you already have. And Italy does have a primary surplus, unlike Greece, though it's getting there. And but the disruption would be large. And Italy is the real Italian economy, although it's depressing and depressed, is nothing like. I mean, it's not a disaster area on the same scale that Greece is, or even Spain. Youth unemployment is very high, and that's disturbing. But I would say that Italy is not in the same desperation. So I wouldn't urge it. And in general, by the way, I have a lot of sympathy for the leaders of the troubled countries, because even if you believe that it's not going to work, even if you believe that in the end, even if you believe that Greece is in the end, it's going to have to leave the euro. The Prime Minister of Greece can't move on that until there are absolutely no alternatives left. Again, Argentina, by the summer of 2001, they knew it wasn't going to work, but you could not be the person to make that happen.
Do you think default absolutely means leaving the currency union?
No, the default, that's very different. I mean, Greece has now defaulted but hasn't left the euro. No, those are very different. But the trouble is that since the fundamental problem is balance of payments and overvaluation, default doesn't solve that problem. So I think you always want to step back. Ultimately, this is not a debt problem. It's not a public debt problem. This is a problem of costs and prices out of line, of capital flows that have dried up, and forcing a balance of payments adjustment. And the question is, how are you going to do that? And so it is ultimately a question of currency rather than of debt. Default doesn't solve the problem.
Thank you.
Professor Krugman, to think a little bit outside the box. In the 1990s, Bob Gordon at Northwestern and Bill Lewis at the Global McKinsey Institute in Washington did a lot of work, as you know, on productivity and deregulation.
Yeah.
One of the findings, as I recall it, was that the growth rate of continental Europe could be doubled merely by microeconomic deregulation of the product and the labor markets. Now, is it possible that if we're going to be stuck with, quote, austerity, something like this, which apparently does not depend, is not sensitive on the state of the business cycle, were it to be possible, could that not help Europe's future?
I'd be shocked if Bob Gordon said it could be doubled. That doesn't sound, maybe, but
it was a group of people, but they were finding the impact was much greater than people had thought. And I know it's politically difficult, but is it not something people like yourself could mention or suggest?
Okay, all right, I guess I'm skeptical. Structural reform is always a good thing if it's appropriate reform, but to pin your hopes on it, I think is probably is probably a mistake. And so and you really need to be careful. By the way, you really need to be careful about interpreting what you see also. If you may recall that last fall, Ireland was being trumpeted as a success story. And that was partly because there was a little bit of an uptick in GDP, which then went away, but also because unit labor costs appeared to have fallen sharply because of a sharp rise in productivity. And it wasn't actually, it was basically a statistical illusion, right? Basically, everything had collapsed except the pharma sector, which has essentially employs no people and has large value added per person it does employ, and it wasn't really happening. So you need to be, structural stuff is always suspect. And at least as I read the Bob Gordon stuff, Europe did lag behind on the productivity acceleration that took place in the United States, but a lot of that was in the service sector. I mean, if you want, it was very much, if you want, not too much of a caricature. It was basically that we were quicker to adopt big box retail, which is fine, but doesn't have much to do with the competitiveness issues that are relevant here. What you need is tradable sectors, and I don't know that anyone has been suggesting that European tradable sectors can achieve a vast productivity explosion through any structural reforms that are on the table.
German ministers have mentioned to me that they attribute a lot of their success in the last 15 years to their structural deregulation of the labor market and stuff. I mean, is that a suggestion there's hope here?
It's not necessarily wrong, but I would have said that Germany has always been remarkably good at exporting, even with costs that appear extremely high. And Western Germany had relatively low unemployment for a long, long time, even at a time that was before the reform. So I mean, it may be true, but I would have thought that and there was a long period. Germany actually did have a sustained period of relative deflation as well, which was achieved, but was achieved the good way, not so much by actual deflation in Germany as through inflation in the peripheral countries. And in a way, what I'm saying is that to make this thing work now, you now need to run that same process, but with the roles reversed.
Well, thank you.
So you had talked about earlier when looking at the LTRO, how essentially it was a backdoor way for the ECB to buy government bonds. What is really the difference then? If the market knows that another LTRO is a possibility, what is the difference between having, an LTRO being an implicit possibility and having a firewall, aside from having it subsidized by the IMF and other countries?
Yeah, no, I don't really see. I don't see the firewall as the issue now. And this is, again, this is one of the misconceptions. It was viewed as a liquidity problem, that what we needed to do was stem the panic. And occasionally you did need to do that. So certainly November 2011 did look like, we really were wondering whether whether the European system would last out the week for a point. There was a point there, but that only buys you some time. And yeah, and the whole Why is the IMF involved here? It's actually a question worth asking, right? It's not. Europe has the resources to bail itself out. So it's a question of internal distribution.
Well,
it doesn't need external money. What? Sorry.
Part of it could be political will.
Well, and someone else. I think there's a little bit. The classic IMF role has been in developing countries forever. That the IMF is someone who acts as basically an absorber of all the hatred. Government officials impose the austerity they know they need to impose, but they can blame the IMF. And so there's some of that, and particularly in this case, if it's going to be, if the Troika is essentially Berlin and Frankfurt and the IMF, one of these is not the same as the other two, at least in appearance, and that's kind of useful. But that's about it. And it doesn't really. And the IMF is now, they're the doves in all of this. They're the ones who are advocating looser monetary policies. They've been improving. I went to the one actual more or less genuine success story in crisis is Iceland. Which is unfortunately has about the population of Somerville, Massachusetts, but and the IMF in Iceland. I went to a conference there, and they're cuddly, they're lovable people. This is not the old IMF, but the IMF is. The only thing about the IMF, they're actually, I think, acting as a ameliorative force on some of the harshness. But you really should. The Europeans should really be asking themselves why. What does this say about us, that for what is essentially an eternal matter, we're having to call on a Washington-based institution to provide a front? Yeah.
Hi, a second question. You say, as we all know, there was an acute crisis last fall in the Eurozone banking system. Can you, and I take it to mean that you, and correct me if I'm wrong, that a bank run was imminent. Can you confirm or deny that a bank run was imminent, and explain also how the ELTRO staved that off?
Well, not sure that there was a bank run on deposits that was imminent. But the European banking system has become heavily dependent on large parts of it are dependent on wholesale financing. So it's like here, we never had a bank run. Barely, we didn't have runs. There were no scenes out of It's a Wonderful Life in the United States. But what you had was a collapse of repo. And the Europeans don't actually have shadow banking to the same extent we do, although I guess Professor Shin tells us that the U.S. shadow banking system is actually run largely through European banks. But it wasn't so much American-style shadow banking as it was just heavy reliance on wholesale financing. So if you look at Spain, if you ask, who financed that housing bubble, how did that happen? A large part of it is, in fact, interbank lending within Europe. Basically, if you like, caricaturing, but it's not too far off, that Landesbanken lending lots of money to cajas, and when that's cut off, all hell breaks loose. And so that was the issue.
But the ELTRO specifically, since the ECB has traditionally been a lender of last resort to banks and was doing that, excuse me, long before last fall, how did the ELTRO specifically stave off a repo crisis? Because
by making the loans contingent on sovereign debt as collateral, the banks in effect had to buy the sovereign debt. And because what you were looking at was collapse in the prices of the sovereign debt. And so the LTRO propped up those prices, and that's what brought the crisis to an end.
Thank you. Thank you.
Wow. So, I guess we're on that happy note.
So thanks to all of you, and thanks especially to Paul.